No one expected the hearing room to fall silent so suddenly. But the moment Senator Chris Van Hollen lifted the whistleblower document, the energy shifted. This wasn't routine oversight anymore. It felt like one of those rare moments when uncomfortable truth forces its way into the open whether institutions are ready for it, or not. As Van Hollen began reading from the complaint, even seasoned lawmakers seemed caught off guard. The allegations were explosive. A Department of Justice attorney claimed DOJ lawyers misled courts, ignored judicial orders, and retaliated against him for refusing to sign an appeal brief he believed was unsupported by evidence or the law. His words were stark. "I didn't sign up to lie." Van Hollen then turned directly to Attorney General Pam Bondi, referencing her earlier Fox News statement, "At my direction, every Department of Justice attorney is required to zealously advocate on behalf of the United States, and any attorney who fails to abide by this direction will face consequences." That set up the core confrontation. Van Hollen asked two direct questions. First, does zealous advocacy ever mean making untruthful statements to a court of law? Second, if not, why was this attorney labeled not zealous after refusing to do exactly that? Bondi immediately invoked pending litigation, saying she could not discuss the substance of the whistleblower lawsuit. But she went further, questioning the timing of the complaint itself. She suggested it was suspicious that the allegations surfaced on the same day as the confirmation hearing of a mall boy, whom she described as one of the best human beings and one of the smartest, most brilliant men she knows. Soon to become a federal judge, Bondi claimed the termination involved disclosure of attorney-client privileged information and insisted she could not elaborate. Still, she stressed that zealous advocacy must always be ethical and honest. She also forcefully defended both a mall boy and Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche, stating that Blanche was present in the room and disputed key accusations made by the whistleblower. Van Hollen acknowledged that the matter would now play out through litigation and due process. But he didn't back away from the concern. He said plainly that the allegations were very, very disturbing, adding that similar warnings had come from officials in other departments, people tasked with enforcing federal law who said they felt pressured to engage in conduct they believed was unethical, and that's where the moment landed. Not with answers, but with an unmistakable signal. The Justice Department isn't just facing political criticism. It's facing internal credibility questions from its own lawyers. Questions that no amount of procedural deflection can make disappear. Van Hollen then moved on to budget concerns, making it clear he wanted to build on questions already raised by Senators Moran and Collins. He focused on a growing problem inside the Justice Department, grant funding being reduced from multiple directions at the same time. First, he pointed to April, when DOJ abruptly terminated hundreds of grant awards. Grantees were notified that their funding had been cut off immediately. These weren't minor programs. They included law enforcement training grants, technical assistance programs, and long-standing awards that stretched back as far as fiscal year 2017. That led to his first direct question: would those canceled funds be restored? Then he raised a second, equally serious issue. In March, Congress appropriated new grant funding for the current fiscal year. But according to Van Hollen, the DOJ has been holding back an overwhelming number of notices of funding opportunities, known as NOFOs. This delay has real consequences. Organizations that depend on these grants, many of them providing direct services to crime victims, are running out of money. In some cases, they are on the brink of shutting down. He gave a specific example: the Office of Justice Programs, the DOJ's largest grant-making division, has posted only one funding notice for fiscal year 2025 so far. No other announcements? No timeline. No clarity. He asked Bondi to address both issues clearly. Bondi responded by acknowledging the concern and calling it a valid question. She said notices would be released in the coming weeks and confirmed that DOJ had reduced grants by 6%. She then made an unusual offer, telling senators that if any grant important to their state had been cut, they should contact her directly. She claimed she had personally restored some grants and said there was an appeal process in place. Her message was simple: pick up, the phone and call me, but that answer did little to ease concerns. Instead of embracing transparency, Bondi appeared to sidestep the broader issue. She didn't use the moment to clearly explain the decision-making process or provide firm assurances. To critics, it looked like more deflection layered over defense, adding weight to the growing cloud hanging over the department she leads for much of the exchange. Van Hollen never raised his voice. He didn't need to. The whistleblower complaint spoke loudly on its own. According to the filing, senior DOJ leadership allegedly engaged in deliberate delays, a lack of candor, and possibly misleading statements when communicating with federal judges. The whistleblower, a former DOJ attorney with years of public service, claimed he was pushed out after refusing to participate in what he believed was misconduct. That allegation alone would shake any functioning institution. What made the moment especially tense was Bondi's refusal to answer the most basic question at the heart of it all. Would she commit to preventing this kind of behavior inside the Justice Department? Instead of addressing the substance, she shifted focus. She defended specific officials by name. She questioned the timing of the complaint. She leaned heavily on the fact that the case was pending and therefore off-limits. As she spoke, Van Hollen watched closely, visibly unsettled. The Attorney General of the United States could not or would not offer a simple pledge to uphold honesty in court proceedings. It was an extraordinary moment. Not because of dramatic accusations, but because of the silence where clarity should have been. And in an institution like the Justice Department, silence can speak louder than any statement. Its credibility depends entirely on integrity. Without it, everything else begins to unravel. Courts rely on the Justice Department to tell the truth. Judges assume that when DOJ files a document, it reflects facts, not spin. When government lawyers walk into a courtroom, they represent the Constitution itself, not the political interests of any administration. That is why a whistleblower's warning carries so much weight. When someone inside the department claims that officials ignored court orders, delayed legal duties, or retaliated against an attorney for refusing to lie, it strikes at the core of the justice system. That is why Senator Van Hollen pushed so forcefully. This was never about partisan politics or personal grudges. It was about whether a system built on trust could continue to function. But instead of meeting that moment with clarity, Bondi responded with deflection. She said she couldn't discuss the complaint. She repeatedly shifted the focus away from the allegations and toward her personal praise of the officials named in them. As she spoke, Van Hollen's frustration gave way to visible disbelief. Moments like that are rare. It is highly unusual to see a sitting attorney general refuse to clearly commit to preventing misconduct, especially misconduct involving the courts themselves. Yet there it was, unfolding live. Impossible to ignore and deeply unsettling. As the questioning continued, the hearing began to expose fractures inside the DOJ that had been forming for months. Reports had already emerged about sudden firings of long-serving career officials, many of whom had enforced federal law under presidents from both parties. Legal experts had warned that entire divisions were being weakened, stripped of leadership, or replaced with figures seen as politically aligned. Then came the sweeping cancellation of public safety grants, funding that communities depended on for critical services, like sexual assault forensic testing and human trafficking investigations. These decisions happened with little explanation, no transparency, and none of the consultation typically required under federal law. With the whistleblower complaint now on the table, those pieces began to connect. What once looked like disorder started to resemble something more deliberate. The allegations suggested a department where decisions were no longer driven by legal duty or public interest, but by internal loyalty. Court orders were allegedly treated as inconveniences. Internal disagreement was reportedly viewed as betrayal. When Van Hollen asked Bondi directly whether the Justice Department must obey court orders, her response landed heavily. She said the department would follow court rulings, but then immediately shifted blame to lower courts and suggested the Supreme Court would ultimately side with the administration. It wasn't a clear promise to uphold the law. It sounded more like a warning that compliance depended on which court was speaking. That moment changed the tone of the room. It wasn't just evasive, it suggested that obedience to the judicial system might be conditional. And for anyone watching, it raised a troubling question. What happens when the nation's top law enforcement agency no longer treats the courts as the final authority? Van Hollen was not alone in sensing the danger. Other senators in the room were clearly disturbed by what they were hearing, because the issue at stake wasn't policy or politics. It was whether the foundation of justice itself was beginning to crack. That exchange laid bare just how deep the problem had become. Each time Senator Van Hollen asked a straightforward questions any attorney general should be able to answer without pause. Bondi responded not with legal principles, but with personal allegiance. Her answers centered on loyalty to individuals, loyalty to leadership, loyalty to a mindset where scrutiny is treated as an attack and accountability is viewed as hostility. Beneath the surface of that back and forth was a far more unsettling realization. The whistleblower may not have been a lone exception. If even part of the allegations were accurate, they pointed to a culture where telling the truth carries risk and honesty before a judge becomes optional. Van Hollen wasn't simply challenging Bondi in that moment. He was confronting an institution that appeared to be drifting away from its ethical foundation, and the consequences were not abstract. They were already being felt in real communities across the country. Months before the hearing, the Justice Department had quietly canceled more than 300 grants. These weren't symbolic programs. They funded violent crime investigations, services for abuse survivors, support for children in foster care, access to forensic medical exams, and critical resources for local law enforcement. Organizations that relied on this funding were caught off guard. Employees were laid off. Victims lost access to help. Investigations slowed or stopped entirely. When questioned about the cancellations, Bondi framed them as routine budget decisions. She argued the cuts were minor in scale and suggested she was open to restoring funding if senators contacted her directly. But Van Hollen and others quickly pushed back. This did not look routine. The cuts disproportionately affected vulnerable populations and targeted programs Congress had explicitly chosen to protect. To many watching, it reinforced the growing belief that decisions inside the DOJ were being shaped by internal politics rather than public responsibility. As the hearing continued, a deeper pattern became impossible to ignore. The Justice Department wasn't merely under pressure, it was changing. An agency once known for its independence now seemed guided by selective loyalty. Legal experience and commitment to justice appeared secondary to alignment with leadership expectations. That is why Van Hollen's questioning carried such urgency. He wasn't seeking headlines or partisan advantage. He was searching for moral clarity. He wanted to know whether the Attorney General would stand up for whistleblowers, insist on honesty in court, and defend the integrity of the department basic obligations that should be automatic for anyone in that role. Instead, he received deflections, personal defenses, and circular responses. The gap between the seriousness of the accusations and the evasiveness of the answers was striking. And then came the moment that defined the entire exchange. Van Hollen asked Bondi directly whether she would allow the kind of behavior described in the whistleblower complaint to continue. It was the simplest question of the hearing, a clear yes or no. Bondi wouldn't say yes. She wouldn't say no. She wouldn't commit to anything at all. Instead, she chose a different path. She offered full, unconditional loyalty to the very people named in the allegations. In that moment, the issue stopped being theoretical. It became clear that if misconduct had taken place, the Department of Justice was not preparing to investigate it. It was preparing to shield it. That realization carries consequences far beyond that single hearing. If loyalty outweighs truth inside the DOJ, if whistleblowers are removed for raising red flags, if court orders are treated as optional suggestions, and if transparency is framed as a threat, then the department ceases to function as an independent guardian of justice. It transforms into something far more dangerous, a political weapon, and that is the core reason this confrontation mattered so much. Van Hollen wasn't just uncovering another controversy. He was issuing a warning about where the justice system could be headed. His message was simple but urgent. The rule of law only survives when the people running the system actually believe in it. And in that moment, it became painfully obvious that the Attorney General's priorities lay elsewhere. Bondi's repeated defense of specific individuals instead of legal principles exposed a culture driven by allegiance rather than ethics. Her refusal to acknowledge the seriousness of the allegations signaled a department unwilling to hold itself accountable, and her avoidance of basic yes or no questions made one thing unmistakably clear: accountability was no longer guaranteed. The hearing eventually ended, but the discomfort did not. What lingered was a question far larger than one whistleblower, far larger than one attorney general, and far larger than any single administration. What happens to a democracy when the institution charged with enforcing justice can no longer be trusted to speak honestly? When whistleblowers feel unsafe, the truth fades. When court orders are ignored, the rule of law erodes. When leaders refuse accountability, corruption stops being an exception and starts becoming the norm. That is the future Van Hollen was pushing back against. And that is why this moment still matters. This isn't about political parties. It's about whether fairness, transparency, and equal justice can survive. Because the truth is straightforward. A democracy cannot endure if those entrusted with enforcing the law refuse to respect it themselves. And if you believe honesty in government matters, if you believe the justice system should serve the public rather than protect insiders, then staying informed isn't optional anymore. Hearings like this show exactly why oversight matters, why whistleblowers matter, and why speaking up matters. If this breakdown helped you understand what's truly at stake, make sure to like the video, subscribe for more in-depth analysis, and share it with someone who needs to see it. Awareness matters, accountability matters, and your attention makes a difference.